Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Dad's Unlimited podcast. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined on the show by none other than Mark Brooks. So, Mark, very warm welcome to the Dad's Unlimited podcast. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, welcome, Phil, and welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Brooks. I'm the chair of the trustees of the Mankind Initiative Domestic Abuse Charity.
Fantastic. So, obviously, a huge area. It's almost one of those things of where do you start? So, I thought what I'd do is just start by asking you what your thoughts or perspectives were on the history of this. And I'm thinking, perhaps for starters, as to how long has the male domestic abuse concept been around in the general consciousness of the public?
Well, in terms of the concept, it's really been around for about 25 years now,
Mm.
partly because that's when there was some initial academic research. Malcolm George, who was a professor, he started to look at this 25 years ago. But also at the same time, there was a number of charities that started to be formed. There was us, and we're based in Somerset, and we were set up during those times at the end of the 90s and became registered charity in 2001 because the people who set the charity up started to have calls from men who were victims of domestic abuse, and actually some of the original founders had been themselves or knew people who were. Also, there was a similar organisation being set up at the same time in Northern Ireland, which is now the Men's Advisory Project. And so, what you had was a gradual start of the academic research, a couple of small charities being set up, and also men starting to come forward. But obviously, the women's movement in terms of supporting female domestic abuse victims is really about 50 years old. So the issue around men as victims was very much came later in the day.
Brilliant. And as far as mankind's concerned, how do you tend to define domestic abuse? I'm thinking about that automatically one tends to think of physical, but I guess that a lot of what you come across as well is the emotional and the mental abuse. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, one of the good things, I mean, the government has done under the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 is actually hard code what the meaning of domestic abuse is. Also, it's not just between partners or ex-partners; it's between adult family members as well. But also, I think the key thing is not just about physical abuse, but also the emotional, psychological abuse, the economic abuse, sexual abuse, and also coercive and controlling behaviour. In also importantly, being threatened, being isolated, being harmed, for example, and actually losing all control of your life. The other important facet is that children are victims, recognised as victims in their own right as well. So there's been some really important steps. So us as a charity, we use the definitions laid out by the government and also used by the rest of the domestic abuse sector. It's really important that there's a level playing field in terms of what we mean by domestic abuse, because if there isn't, you end up arguing about that rather than trying to push for the actual issues to be solved.
Yeah. And is it fair to assume again that the stereotypical perspective that males are tough and stiff upper lip and all that kind of thing, and this doesn't happen to men? Has there been a tendency historically to sweep it under the carpet or pretend it's not happening because it's a male that's on the receiving end of it, as opposed to what you might call a stereotypical female in historical terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's still very much that stereotype, not only in kind of men and how it impacts men, because men will think, well, how can I be a victim? Am I a victim? Lots of calls we get and other help calls there, other helplines, including Dad's Unlimited, will be from men asking, am I actually a victim? And they will talk through what's actually happening to them. And often our job is to help them put two and two together, that they recognize the abusive behaviors, they recognize they're wrong, but they don't think, the light bulb doesn't go off and think, oh, that's domestic abuse. So you've got that from the male perspective, and that's really how kind of men, especially middle-aged men, I mean, it's different now with relationship education in schools, but certainly middle-aged men and older just don't recognize domestic abuse as a thing that could happen to them. And part of that's around society and what the expectations placed on men. But then on the flip side, you've got society not recognizing it in men. So you've got friends and family not always recognizing the fact that, if they've got a son or a brother that they haven't seen for ages, got a new partner, do they just think, oh, well, he must be, in love, new woman, new man, and he must be all loved up, for example, so we won't get in touch with him, even though we've not heard from him for ages. So sometimes there can be this lack of what I would call spidey sense in terms of picking up the signs that a man that somebody knows could be in a difficult relationship. And also, we see a lack of professional curiosity often in the health service, in the council services, and sometimes in the police about what really is happening to a man that's got bruises, trying to hide them, very anxious, very depressed, not seen for a while. And they're the sort of starting to self-medicate, drugs and drink, for example. And actually, do professionals think, oh, I wonder if there's something going on in his backstory, in his family, or in his household that's causing these problems?
It's very interesting. You mentioned there about the fact that a lot of often males will be contacting you to clarify almost as if they are being abused. Is that the same generally with women and females, or do you think that they are more instinctively know when that abuse is happening?
Well, it's an interesting thing because
Yeah.
we decided as a charity some years ago that we wouldn't really comment on whether it's different for women or not, because we're not an expert.
Yeah, sure.
And I wouldn't want to say, oh, well, it's different. Men have it worse, men have it better, because we know that so many women also that just have terrible experiences. So we decided that we thought it was better not to compare men with women unless there's some sort of statistics and they just help with context, really. But certainly for the men that we get, that is an issue. And I think part of it is because it's just not in the media enough. There isn't the talked about enough in society. So a lot of those men, on average, will have been going through the abuse for about 6 years before they contact us.
Wow.
And also, many of those men were the first people they've spoken to. And also, about two-thirds of the men have said that they won't call us unless we're anonymous. So you can clearly see that a lot of those men are just wanting to check. The other thing, if I may add, is that around 1 in 5 of the calls we get are actually on behalf of men. So we get loads of sisters, mothers, daughters, female friends, as well as obviously male equivalents as well,
Right.
contacting us, checking
Mm.
up, whether almost going through that same validation process that, I think I'm worried about my son or my brother, for example. So we get lots of calls in that respect, which obviously we really encourage. And I think one that sticks out in my mind was where we had on the call on a speakerphone in the same house, we had the grandmother, the mother, and also the sister on the phone at the same time because they were really worried about one of their male family members. And a lot of those calls we get, actually, the man doesn't know that those calls are taking place. So, so a sister or mother's ringing up, but they haven't told their son or brother they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you say though, the reality is it's a human problem, isn't it? It's not about male, female.
Mm.
How do you encourage men to open up about it? There's been a lot of discussion and debate over the last few years, hasn't there, about, just talk and certain campaigns about just open up and talk. Is that something you do as well as a charity? Do you have to try and encourage and help people to open up and actually acknowledge it and accept the help that's there.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, more and more men are coming forward to get help on a range of issues. And also, there's a lot of what I would call damaging mythology about, oh, men don't talk. Well, men do talk, they just
Mm.
talk differently. They don't tend to want to talk face to face, they want to talk shoulder to shoulder and often doing an activity. And also that they want some form of confidence that they're, especially on initial disclosure, that there will be a form of anonymity also, and confidentiality. And often men do talk, and find out what's going on. They use the web a lot, so not only web chats, for example, but also just getting information from the website, and websites. And there's other organisations where you've got broader organisations like Andy Mann's clubs, and you've got men's sheds, for example. So men do talk, they just talk differently, and you've got to create the environment, consequence-free environment, and then they will talk. So there's always I find it disconcerting that that level of mythology, or men don't talk, it's their fault. Also, that whole mythology is placing responsibility on the shoulders of men and not on the shoulders of society and public services to make it easier for men, and employers, of course, easier men for talk. So ask, listen, encourage action, and also check in, and they're really important facets. So more and more men are talking. The last thing is you've got to have it, as I said, this accessibility. So you've got to have helplines which are open, which are convenient, as I said, and give confidence that there's a certain level of anonymity. What we do on our helpline is that we listen to men, we give them some basic information, how to approach services like the police, and also local domestic abuse services, and we signpost them to them. Because the one big change that's happened in the last 10 years, and we've been pushing for this, as colleagues at Dads Unlimited and other organisations, is that in every town, city and county now in the UK there is a domestic abuse service which is available for men. So that's been a real change in the last 10 years, because that wasn't the case 10 years ago, but it is now.
That's very interesting. And is there any work or any specific focused effort to get your message across, say, within the workplace at all? I'm thinking about where it might be a very male dominated workplace, which you can very easily stereotype with this, but generally speaking, there might be certain, like, I don't know, the construction industry must
Mm.
be statistically a lot more guys on the building sites. Is there any way, or is there any thought given to how you might be able to reach them in those environments, or is it more of a consumer scenario?
Well, I think it's a mixture, and what we've found, there's a really good organisation called IDA, Employees Initiative Against Domestic Abuse, um, and they've got hundreds of organised companies, from small companies to the big multinationals, and many of them are construction. In the construction or in the trades, for example, or industrial manufacturers. And so basically what we've started to find is that there has been more focus from employers, including in those sectors, around male domestic abuse, but also on men's health in general. I mean, one of the key stats is that men in the construction industry are over 3 times more likely to take their own lives than men who work in offices, for
Wow.
example. So there's a huge number of mental health and other challenges across those industries affecting men, and so domestic abuse will certainly be part of that. So certainly we're working with a lot more employers. You've got IDA, who do a really good job, that when they're reaching out to employers, they're very inclusive, to make sure that men are included. And of course, that's men in all shapes and sizes. So that's men in same-sex relationships, that's men who are disabled, men from ethnic backgrounds, for example. And it's always important just to not to stereotype a kind of typical type of guy who's going through this. It happens to men from all backgrounds.
Interesting. Is there any geographical evidence at all as well, Mark, in terms of it happening more in the north? And again, not wanting to be stereotypical, is there any evidence to show that it happens maybe more in the north or the south, or is there anything around that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a stats geek, so I do look at this, and on a regional basis, there isn't actually. I mean, there isn't from a regional basis. What we do find is that men from lower socioeconomic groups are slightly more likely to be a victim, but importantly, it's only slightly. So we get guys who are calling us who are in the top echelons of society, and so we get men who and also men in the police force. We get calling men who are GPs and others. So there are some trends, but it's really slight. It's almost not worth really commenting on. I mean, but what the key thing is that often men who are stuck in relationships, it's harder for them. And what I mean by that is that men who are married, have mortgages, have children, it's far harder for them to actually get out of a relationship than men who don't have those things. So what you tend to do is that while you have, generally speaking, younger men, same for younger women actually, are more likely to be a victim of domestic abuse, they're more likely to actually get out of that relationship because they don't have these, what I call magnets, pulling them back into a relationship. And the magnets primarily mortgage, marriage, and children.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting actually, and I can see the logic of that totally. Okay, well, obviously not asking you to be Nostradamus or anything like that, Mark, but where do you see things going around the support for this? Do you think it's likely, and I won't quote you on this, of course. Do you think it's likely that there's going to be more and more of these sorts of challenges and issues, and more of the need for these support services? And I'm thinking mainly, perhaps, just making certain assumptions on society, the pressures, the stresses. I'm thinking about, obviously, we've all seen relatively recently the significant increase in the cost of living problems and the issues surrounding that. We've obviously only a year or two out of COVID. Do you think it's going to continue on an upward trajectory in terms of the demand for services like yours?
Well, it's an interesting issue because,
Mm.
generally speaking, domestic abuse has fallen for women and men over the last 15 to 20 years. I mean,
Right.
it's one of those issues that that the government statistics, and they've asked the same questions year on year, show that gradually it's falling. So, but we have seen an uptick in during COVID, coming out of COVID. And part of that is driven by the fact that the domestic abuse has intensified, but it was already there. So COVID and coming out and the cost of living pressures has not necessarily triggered lots more domestic abuse. What it has done is made matters worse for those in those relationships. And what we're seeing coming out of that is more and more men actually coming forward to getting help. So, calling helplines, for example, you're seeing more traffic on websites, more men going to those local services that I mentioned, which is obviously a good thing, because it shows that men who have been going through this are actually now reaching out for that help. So you've kind of got a dichotomy, really, or you've got more. It's not necessarily going up, but you've got more men coming forward, and we're seeing that we've got more services. I mentioned we've got more refuge, safe houses for men. We've got more specialist workers in the domestic abuse industry now, who are exclusively or primarily working with men. About 35 now, and that wasn't there even 5 years ago. So more men are coming forward. We are getting a broad range of services. There's still some political challenges with a small p. I mean, still all domestic abuse, all male victims of domestic abuse, including male boys as well, are classed by the government as being victims of violence against women and girls, which is, Orwellian. I've said it often enough, and lots of organisations across sexual violence, sexual abuse sector feel the same. That this is kind of like we've got to a point where a man or a boy who's the victim of domestic abuse is not a woman or a girl. And even saying that in 2024 is kind of like you scratch your head. Why are you even saying that? So, and men and boys are included under the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which we don't think is appropriate. We think have a vague strategy for women and girls. That's all good, rightly so. But you can't shoehorn men and boys into that. And that's something that needs to change, because we believe that that's actually holding back the number of men coming forward and also the provision of services.
It's interesting. And you mentioned government there, and I'm going to change slight tack on government. What's the sort of support that you get financially from governments and from the state, I guess you might call it? Is it reasonable? Is it there at all? Is it reasonable? Or is it a lot of private funding that you have to do to fund these sorts of activities?
Well, for us as a charity, we primarily get money from donations and public and companies with respect to support for our helpline. And we do deliver some services and training for organisations as well, and obviously we're funded to do that. But in terms of the government, the government doesn't fund us, but then we don't apply. So it's don't apply in that way. But they do fund a helpline for men, and also they've made sure by putting more funding into the domestic abuse sector that those extra roles that I mentioned, that's come about broadly because there's more money going into the DA sector, domestic abuse sector, by the government. So, of course, the government can do more. I think for me, it's the political landscape that I need them to change, because that will then help more services. Obviously, money would be great as well, but I think it's a political landscape, because there have been positive changes in the last 5 years, and some of that will be down to more funding from the government.
Well, I just think it's all very interesting and all very credible, what the work that you're doing, and congratulations for the work that you're doing. How do people find out more then, Mark, about Mankind and you, and how can they find out more? You've got a website, for example?
Yeah, we do. And the thing is, Phil, just to reiterate, I mean, although we've been around quite a long time now, it is a team effort, and we work as part of a team. Colleagues at Dads Unlimited, colleagues at other charities, the community-based services I mentioned, those particular professionals. So, we've been, we've played a role in that, but it's very, it's partnership and it's teamwork. And that's always important to get across. In terms of academics, of course, there's a growing academic network in the UK around these subjects. And I'd say UK is, I would say, in terms of the volume of work, is world leading when it comes to research into the experiences of male victims. In terms of our website, please go on mankind.org.uk. There's lots of information and tips and tools, information about some of the training that we do, but also there's lots of facts and figures and research as well. So, please do dip into the website. It's also got, obviously, the contacts, importantly, of all of those local services that support men, and also our helpline as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you've just made me think of another question, so I'm going to ask it. It's my show because I can ask it.
That's all right, Phil.
So you mentioned there about overseas, or about UK being ahead of the game. What is the perspective? And I'm not expecting you to go through every single country in the world, obviously, but what is the perspective on male domestic abuse, generally speaking, in perhaps just in other countries, in say the Europe, just as a kind of a start point of that? Is there is there an approach to it which is, do they dismiss it? Do some countries dismiss it more? Do some people engage with it more? What's the general differences in the geographical spread across across Europe and maybe the world?
It's difficult to know,
Yeah.
but certainly it's very, I'd say, sporadic, or not consistent. I mean, in the UK and also in the Republic of Ireland. I mean, it's a really good service in the Republic of Ireland, Men's Aid Ireland. So, you know, UK and Ireland in terms of focus or awareness of male victims and service provision, you know, our two countries are well ahead of the game. There's some provision in Australia, but there's not very much elsewhere. And if you're looking at Europe, you know, mainland Europe, there's some research, but I don't think, and there's the odd organisation doing some work, but we get contacted quite a lot from organisations on mainland Europe, um, and also from researchers saying there's just nothing for men in those countries. And you know, just recently I had a call from somebody from the BBC who's looking at domestic abuse in Spain, for example, and you know, she was asking me about, well, she about what is there for men in Spain. She had spent ages looking all over Spanish websites, government, and there's no reference to male victims at all, let alone any services. So I think it's very I think it's very sporadic. There's some small projects, but it's not system wide. And in the UK and Ireland, you've got systemic support, supported systemic support. So UK and Ireland are well ahead of the game, I think. And we get those calls from other countries, and we give them information, and you know, we provide whatever support is needed, but far more is needed.
Well, something to be proud of for once for the UK, something to be proud of. It must be great, though, to be potentially an inspiration to other parts of the world as well in the work that you do, as well as obviously what you're doing for the people, the individuals concerned. So, Mark, thanks very much indeed for joining me today on this podcast. Very, very interesting. Really enjoyed talking to you. Some lots of things to ponder. And thank you very much indeed. Maybe I'll see you in person one day when I'm in the south of England.
Absolutely, Phil. Been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Bye bye.